Welcome to the Pharma Forum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Jem Zorlula, CEO of Air Kim Pharmaceuticals. Since 1981, Air Kim has been serving as a regional affiliate for some of the world's top pharma and biotechnology companies, delivering novel treatments to patients in the CEE and the Mediterranean. Welcome, Jem.
Thanks, Nicole. Great to be here.
So today, however, we'll be discussing early access programs for novel medicines, an often misunderstood strategy outside of Western markets. But before we dive into our topic at hand, Jem, I know you've been on the podcast before and listeners probably remember you being on the podcast, but perhaps before we continue, you could again share with listeners a quick overview of your journey to today and the path that led you to your work at Air Kim.
So my journey actually starts since I was born, because Air Kim is a family company found my grandfather. But personally, I have started my professional career at a consulting company, working with biopharma companies to bring their medicines to global markets. Then I had a journey in the tech space, leading Palantir's work across a wide variety of geographies and subject matters, including healthcare. But what got me to my current position today was the sudden death of my father, whose shoes I had to fill by coming in and leading Air Kim along with my brother. But it was also very close with my mission as a company, because when my father was ill, we could not get access to the treatments that were readily available for so many people in the Western Hemisphere. So it also personally drives my mission to accelerate and expand access to these life-saving and life-improving treatments all around the world.
Thank you, Jem, for sharing that very personal journey to what you do today. So if we turn to those early access programs, or EAPs, they can drive revenue for pharmaceutical companies, especially from international unlicensed markets. But most importantly, EAPs allow patients access to, as you suggested then, life-altering novel medicines. Specifically for rare diseases, these early access programs can play an important role in the timely delivery of medicines that can alter patients' lives. And if strategically planned, upon the approval of a drug by a regulatory agency, treatments can be readily available to patients before the broader commercialization process is implemented, which is critical as time is of the essence for most patients suffering from rare diseases. Jem, can you tell us more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about using the word EAP, we think from a very Western perspective, where there is a pending approval and EAP ends up being the bridge. I think, well, it is the case that the definition here is a bit different in these markets, where it is a well-known fact that the medicines go through the full commercialization pathway much later in the life cycle, if at all. So in these markets, EAP tends to morph into something that sits somewhere between full commercialization or a long-term stable approach to make sure that the medicines can get to the patients as early as possible and as consistently as possible. So as far as how these programs work, there is a different set of structures, but the key idea you should keep in mind is that these programs are designed by the policymakers in these countries in line with what the needs and the challenges of these countries are. So therefore, what these programs, be it early access or even longer term programs, are effectively designed to make sure that more pharmaceutical companies are able to make their products available as early as possible so that their patients can get access to these treatments very soon. And these programs do contribute to a large portion of international revenues for biopharma companies, where I remind you that in a rare disease launch, US actually makes less than 40% of global revenue. So these programs, when added together, different ways of delivering access to patients, be it formal EAPs or even longer term EAPs that morph into quasi-commercial, that ends up being an important driver of both access as well as commercial revenue.
Thank you, Jem. So I just want to tunnel down further into market access strategies in many international markets in the way that they, as you've just been describing, do not function the same way as they do in the US, for example, or Western Europe even, and they require a different approach. So I was wondering, before we sort of go deeper into commercialization and EAPs as well, can you provide detailed information about how these programs are regulated and implemented in various regions, including potential government funding and incentives to support EAPs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to sort of take a step back and look from the need, how, what drives this policy. And when you look at this, there's two different things. One, these countries have different needs. They might face a budget issue. They might have to grapple with the fact that pharmaceutical companies don't have enough resources to launch the products as soon as possible across all around the world. So these are the issues that the countries deal with. On the other hand, these countries tend to have a different set of priorities compared to, say, a Western pharmaceutical markets. You know, in the US, there is a more balance between adult and pediatric population, whereupon in certain markets, majority of the funding goes to pediatric population. So based on these, countries tend to design policies that try to accelerate the medicines that they need and decelerate the medicines that they don't really need. So what you end up with are effectively government-run reimbursement programs that are pretty much agnostic of whether a product is registered or not locally. There is a lot of implementations of these programs across the board. Some countries effectively waive the need to register if it's a rare disease product, for example. Some other countries put it under the formal sort of named patient program auspices, but the fact of the matter is the access levels tend to be fairly high, most of the patients being able to access treatments based on the rules of the treatment program. So in countries like Turkey, Greece, Kazakhstan, all patients can access these treatments, whereupon countries like Russia prioritize pediatric patients where there's pretty much unfettered access. For adults, it's a bit different story. So really changes from country to country. But what one needs to remember there is that it is driven by the need, and it is a specific government policy to accelerate, to make things easier for biotech companies, because these governments know one way or another that small biotechs that are working on a really important, challenging disease don't have the resource of a big pharma. Therefore, they need to make things easy for them. They recognize that, and that drives the access discussion.
Thank you, Jim. So if we focus for a moment on this notion of making things easier for biotechs. Now, EAPs can also help shape the biotech space by supporting the opportunity for RWD collection outside of the clinical trial setting and helping pharma companies gain momentum with local payers, regulators, the medical community. And compiled RWD can act as a, so to speak, stress test for companies looking to launch their treatment in non traditional priority markets where there may not be an existing track record for commercial launch, as we've been discussing. I was just wondering, before we really dive into commercialization, whether you could tell us more about that, Jem.
Yeah, I think to your point, it is very important to start generating real world data from markets where patients are able to access. There are different levels of legal structure behind how you can do it. But at the end of the day, it is possible to collect real world data from the real world use of the medicine in the markets that are accessing the medicine through an early access program. And this ends up being very important from being able to build a data package that would be relevant for reimbursement discussions, either in the country that we are operating or even building a broader data package, which is doubly important in rare and ultra rare diseases, where from data perspective, every single patient recruited to a real world data collection effort does make a difference. And that's where, casting a wide net from real world data perspective ends up being crucial, because you're able to reach a much larger patient population versus if you were to limit it to a very small subset of countries.
Absolutely. Okay, so now let's, as we've been suggesting, tunnel down into commercialization and EAPs. As you've been explaining for listeners, Jem, what is often misunderstood outside of Western markets is that EAPs are best viewed from a commercial perspective, and EAPs and drug commercialization are extremely integrated. Working under the assumption that a drug has received regulatory approval, EAPs can be a critical start to commercialization process and can help dictate the success of a drug's distribution. Similar to the commercialization process, EAPs are required to go through a strict process. Jem, can you expand on this for us, please?
Absolutely. So there is a strict governance in terms of how these programs are being run, because to my earlier point, these programs end up being an integral path for a large portion of the patients to access the treatments. So therefore, just like how it's governments that are designing these programs, they implement a fair bit of pharmacovigilance, supply chain quality, compliance, and legal requirements to make sure that the patients are able to access safe and effective treatments, and local laws do end up being respected by companies operating in the EAP space.
Thank you, Jem. So my last question is about closing thoughts for our listeners to mull over. And I was wondering if you could leave us with a nugget or several nuggets of inspiration about future thoughts on EAPs.
In terms of looking at EAPs, there's a couple of key takeaways from this conversation. One is to effectively not use the word EAP in terms of thinking outside the Western scope. It is different programs, but some of them end up being very long-term than a intermediary. Second is to think very carefully about how they can contribute to a launch of a global medicine. We talked about real-world data. We also should consider the commercial impact of it. These programs can deliver substantial revenue that might help a public company to show track record and growth from financial perspective to the investors. We've seen this multiple times with some of our partners. And third is to never forget compliance, because the requirements of these programs tend to be significantly higher in terms of compliance, regulatory, local laws than an EAP program that one might supply to in a Western context. These will be my three sort of main takeaways from this discussion.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I think the main one there, perhaps, don't use the term EAPs outside of Western markets. Thank you for your time today, Jim. It's been an absolute pleasure again.
Thanks, Nicole.
And so that concludes another episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous instalments at pharmaforum.com/podcasts. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for Pharma Forum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at Pharma Forum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.